All right, so I am Alex Miller. This is Alex Nagy, Alex and Alex. I think he goes by the other Alex sometimes, or sometimes I do. It's hard to keep track. Together, we are the artistic duo called SPACEFILLER. And we do interactive installation art. Sometimes it has an audio component to it. And we're really interested in the idea of chaos, specifically order versus chaos and the transition between order and chaos. This is not a new idea. I mean, this is something that lots of people are interested in, but we really like to explore this idea in depth. And so this talk is called On the Edge of Chaos, and we're going to be talking about how we use this concept of order versus chaos in our art. And we're also going to be giving an example of a mathematical system that exhibits chaos. First, though, I just want to show some images of our work. This is a piece that Alex Nagy is going to be talking about later. It's called Algoplex 2. It's a projection-mapped 3D sculpture. Not sure if there's going to be audio here. This is another projection-mapped piece that's in a retail space where the viewers can pick a shoe off a platform and it reacts to them.
I'm going to give a quick behind-the-scenes look at our process.
My voice is also playing, which is kind of confusing. I didn't mean to have audio there. Sorry about that. Talking over myself. Let's see. Next slide. There we go. This is a recent piece that we completed, which is an algorithmically generated ecosystem that's on the side of an apartment building. And so this is something that persists over time. It's a permanent installation, and the idea is that these creatures grow and change over time, and there's a seasonality to how the creatures move. And so the idea is that as folks walk by the sidewalk who live in this apartment building, they can kind of start to form relationships with these creatures and interact with them. So that's some of our work, and I'm going to get into a formal definition of chaos, and then Alex Nagy is going to follow that up with examples of more of our work that use this idea of chaos. So we're going to be talking about models of population growth. And a good way to think of this is we're from Seattle, Washington, and there's a lot of squirrels in the parks in Seattle. And some summers there are almost no squirrels, and some summers there's a shit ton of squirrels. And it's kind of hard to figure out what patterns there are in these squirrel populations. So have that idea in your mind. We're talking about squirrels kind of growing and dying, okay? And you can imagine that in Seattle, there is a maximum number of squirrels that the environment will sustain. So let's say there's like 100,000 squirrels possible in Seattle. There's also a minimum number of squirrels, which would be 0 squirrels, all the squirrels being dead. So, oh, you know what? I forgot, there's something else I wanted to talk about before I delve into the squirrel example. My apologies. So before I talk about chaos, I want to talk about order, okay? So let's rewind a little bit. Let's talk about order first. And we're going to talk about some systems that show order. So this is a very ordered system. We start with a ball that's up on the side of a hill. The ball rolls down to the center of the valley, and it stays there for all eternity. Very simple system. And we can categorize this system as fixed point behavior. Okay? This is this nomenclature that I'm using from the study of dynamical systems, which is kind of the study of systems that evolve over time. This is fixed point behavior. Here's another ordered system. This is a pendulum. It starts off on the left, and then we swing to the right, and then we swing back again, and this is periodic behavior. Okay? So a little bit different than the fixed point behavior, but the similarity is that they're both very predictable. So if you view a short duration of the system, then you can make predictions about the long-term behavior of the system, right? And I'm showing a very simple example of periodic behavior right here, but you can imagine that there can be arbitrarily complex versions of periodic behavior, planets, orbiting each other and stuff like that, okay? So apparently, for a long time, mathematicians and physicists believed that the entire universe could be divided up into these two types of behavior. And the idea was that we lived in a clockwork universe, right? That everything was deterministic, or I guess the idea is that if everything is deterministic and you have complete knowledge of the universe and you understand all the physical laws of the universe, then you can predict all future states, right? But we now know that that's not true, that there is a third behavior that systems can exhibit, which is chaotic behavior. And chaotic behavior is characterized by its unpredictability. And in fact, even if you have a deterministic system, which is chaotic, you still can't predict long-term behavior very well. You might be able to predict short-term behavior, but you're not able to predict long-term behavior. So this is getting back to that idea of the squirrels in Seattle, right? How do you know how many squirrels there are going to be in the parks? Like maybe on a summer-to-summer basis, it's easy, but maybe 20 years out, it might be a little bit harder to predict, okay? So let's get back into that squirrel example. We're gonna talk about a growth model of these squirrels. So again, like I was saying, you can imagine there's like a maximum number of squirrels possible, like 100,000 squirrels in Seattle, and there's a minimum, which would be 0 squirrels. We're gonna use this variable x to represent the population density. And this is a variable that's gonna range between 0 and 1, where 1 represents maximum population. So that would be like at our 100,000 squirrel mark. And 0 representing the minimum, which would be 0 squirrels. It's a little bit confusing to represent this with a decimal number maybe, but the idea is that, you know, if this is at 0.5, we're at kind of half full population density. And so that would correspond to half of whatever your maximum number of squirrels is, okay? And then we're gonna use this variable in an equation. We're gonna start to build our model of how these squirrels are, how this population of squirrels is growing. And what this is saying is that we take the previous generation of squirrels, n, the population for that previous generation, we multiply it by some growth factor, and that spits out the population for the next generation, n plus 1, okay? So let's just do a quick example of this. Let's say we start out with 0.5, that's our initial condition for our population model. We plug it into an equation. I'm gonna use 1.1 here as our growth factor, this g value. You can choose an arbitrary growth factor, right? So I'm just gonna choose 1.1 and see what happens. And then that will spit out 0.55. Then I take that 0.55 and I plug it back into our growth model and I get another number out, 0.605. And I can just continue to do this and get new generations, okay? And this is a very simple example, and so you might be able to see right off the bat, this is, you know, linear growth. We're just multiplying by 1.1 every time. The important thing to understand is that we're taking the last generation and that's influencing the next generation, okay? So if we were to plot this, it would just be a linear up and to the right chart, okay? This is not a very interesting model of population growth. There's no complexity or chaos here. What are we missing from this? Death, is that what I heard? Yeah, we're missing death. The squirrels aren't dying right now and they need to die. So here's how we're gonna do that. We're going to add in a death term. So I think of this x times g as kind of the growth term. This is how the squirrel population is growing. And then this 1 minus x sub n is going to kind of keep the squirrel population down. It's gonna counteract that growth term. So now we're taking that previous generation and we're plugging it in 2 places in our growth model. So just to do a really quick example, let's say we start with 0.5 again. We take that 0.5, we plug it into our model, we do some math, and on the next generation we get 0.25. Okay, now we take that 0.25, we plug it in again, and we get 0.1875. Okay, in these examples, I've set that growth factor to 1, just to keep things really simple. And the math here is not important, so don't worry if you're not following this, it doesn't really matter. The idea is that now that we've added in this death term, our population model is decreasing like this picture, okay? So that's not super interesting because all of our squirrels are dying, right? And so the thing we can do is we can boost up this g value to counteract the effect of this death term, right? And this is where things start to actually get very interesting. So I'm gonna switch over to a website that I've created to demonstrate this. So this is an interactive website that allows us to play with 2 parameters. We can play with our starting value, and we can play with that growth factor, that g value. And hopefully you can read that. Can everybody read that? This right here is the growth factor. Is that readable? Okay. So as I increase this growth factor, something that you can see pretty quickly here is that our population is kind of leveling off. It's converging to a certain number of squirrels, a certain population density. And so this is that fixed point behavior. We have some movement in the beginning and then we just stay the same forever, very predictable. I can change this starting value and you can see that the system doesn't really care what the starting value is. It's resilient to changes in the starting condition. As I increase the growth factor, something a little interesting happens. We get kind of these little squiggly bits at the beginning, okay? We get a little bit of oscillation at the beginning, but we're still in that fixed point behavior where we're converging to a value over time. Now, as I continue to increase it, something important happens. I switch from that fixed point behavior to periodic behavior. So now I'm in this regime where my population is bouncing back and forth. So this might be, maybe I'm sampling the squirrels every summer, and on even years, there's a high population, and on odd years, there's a low population, right? This is still this very regular, but it's this oscillating pattern. And I think that this transition is kind of interesting. And then we get to something even more interesting. As we increase the growth factor, we split from a period 2 oscillation to a period 4 oscillation. And you can see when I say split, the top and the bottom values kind of both split off, right? You see that? And then as I continue to increase it, it starts to get wild. We start to get chaotic, okay? And so now with my growth factor here, for example, this is now an unpredictable system. There's no regular oscillation that continues for infinity. There are patterns. There are things that you can actually see and hear and kind of decipher, but in general, in the long term, you can no longer predict information about this system, even though, remember, we started with a very simple mathematical equation that was very deterministic. There's no randomness here. There's no dice rolls, right? We think this idea is really interesting, and I think one of the things that we're most fascinated by in our art is this transition from order to chaos. And it's particularly this moment where you kind of go from this very ordered system to this very chaotic system all at once. You have this chaos that kind of emerges from the order. One other thing I wanted to show is when I'm in this chaotic regime and I change the starting value, things go crazy, things go nuts, right? Our chaotic system is very sensitive to the initial starting conditions. Whereas when I'm in one of these ordered periodic states, things change a little bit, but mostly they stay the same, okay? Here's another picture of this idea. So this is called a bifurcation diagram. Whoop, those are emojis, I don't want those. Let's see if I can get, okay, there we go. So what this shows is on the x-axis, we have our growth factor, okay? So that's that value that we were changing back and forth here. And then on the y-axis, we have our population density, but it's our asymptotic population. So this is what the population converges to after many iterations of the system. So what I mean by that is if we set our growth factor to here, some arbitrary point, and I want to know what does our system converge to, what is this fixed point that we're going to land at, what I can do is I can just follow that red line up and then trace it over to the y-axis, and I know that this convergence point is around 0.5 population or whatever, right? So this picture kind of is a map of what's going on as we increase this parameter. And if you see here, this split point right here corresponds to that transition from the fixed point behavior to the periodic behavior. This is called a bifurcation point. And then we have similar split points right here, right? So we go from 2 to 4, and then we go from 4 to 8. There's kind of this recursive exponential structure to this diagram, and eventually we hit this fuzzy, noisy zone, which corresponds to the chaotic region. And why is this chaos noisy? Well, because it's not converging to any numbers. It's just going it's hitting all the different population values, and so it kind of fills in the diagram as this kind of speckly chaos. And so now we start to get into maybe some of the artistic side of things. This looks beautiful. It has kind of this intrinsic beauty to it that we find really interesting. One last thing here. You'll notice that there's these strips of darkness in the chaos. And these indicate that there are regions of stability within the instability. They're kind of like calm within the storm. And you can see if I scroll through those, I'm looking at a periodic structure again. And I think this is really inexplicable and just kind of mysterious and beautiful. And I'm sure that if you were better at math than we are, then maybe you'd have a deeper understanding of this. And I'm sure a lot of you probably do. But to me, creating this very simple system and having this kind of fall out of it was just really, really fun and beautiful. And we like things to be fun. We like fun algorithms. Okay, so that's kind of an explanation of chaos versus order. Any questions so far? Yeah.
The white dot that's implied there, where they all cross, can you go there so we can, what's special about that?
This thing right here? So yeah, if anybody else knows why this is here, raise your hand and let me know. What I think this might be, I have a guess of what this is, and I think that it might be an artifact of the way that I'm generating this diagram, in that I am basically, to find these asymptotic population values, I'm just looping over this model to some fixed threshold, and what I think might be happening is that I need to like loop further to kind of rid myself of maybe some structure in the model, if that makes sense. But that's just a guess. I actually don't know. Does anybody know? Who knows about systems like this? Okay, good, because that would make me look bad. So, any other questions? The question in the back? Yeah. Great question. So I have suspiciously cut off my scale at 4. And that's for a very important reason. The way that this equation works, if you go past 4, you start to get nonsensical population densities. So either you get like above 1 or below 0. So this parameter is actually fixed within the range 0 to 4. And there's like a reason for that you can kind of work out if you look at some math. Okay, any other questions before we move on? I can't really see, so maybe you might have to shout out. Okay. Great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alex Nagy, who's going to talk about how we use some of these ideas of order versus chaos in our artwork. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I am the other Alex, and I'm going to be talking about one of our pieces in particular, and that piece is Algoplex 2. We're going to ask some more questions later, and whatever you do, please do not ask about Algoplex 1. It is forbidden. That being said, I'm going to play this video and kind of describe exactly the different parts that make up Algoplex 2. All right, so Algoplex 2 is comprised of 3 separate parts. First part is a sculptural 3D lattice structure, and that is what you see in the back here, this kind of these like cups, and these cups serve the function of catching light from the projector, which is the second part of Algoplex 2. It's this digital projection that is cast onto the structure, and it's actually specifically projection mapped to every single node and every single edge of that 3D geometry. The third part is a control panel, which you can see here. And that control panel consists of 6 different knobs and 1 button. So the 6 knobs are hooked up to parameters within these what we call algorithmically generated scenes. And the button is used to switch between them. So I'll just kind of give a quick blanket statement of Algoplex 2, and then I'll start getting into these algorithmically generated scenes. So Algoplex 2 invites the viewer to navigate a pleasantly disorienting algorithmic playground, and in the process, discover the mysterious world that lives between natural order and chaos. What does that mean? Well, let's get into it. So I mentioned that there are these scenes, these algorithmically generated kind of mini universes or environments or animals or whatever. That's kind of like the beauty of this piece, is that the viewer or the participant can really make what they want out of it. And we get a lot of our inspiration from nature and natural processes and models of, how do we recreate these things in a digital environment. By keeping visuals vague and abstract, we really kind of give the viewer the power to interpret that. So, for example, a lot of people thought that this scene was it reminded them of lightning or possibly a root system, even worms. We had a lot of really surprising references to natural animals, weather systems. It was really fun. In fact, that's kind of one of the most fun parts about it, is letting people decide for themselves what that piece means, what each scene represents to them. Or how they interpret it in view of the natural world. So what we're doing here is we're taking these mathematical models that, say, like a scientist or a mathematician would use in their line of work, and we're hooking them up to really simple visuals, and then we're distorting these models. We're kind of like, changing one boundary and, setting it way off into infinity, or we're just molding it in a way that's you wouldn't really want to use in a professional setting, but is possibly kind of fun if you let people play around with it. So essentially, these algorithms are tools, but at this point, we've kind of turned them into toys. So yeah, order and chaos are two of the themes that we use heavily in a lot of our work. And I think what makes chaos and order such a fun subject to play with is that there is this really interesting in-between area. And that is where a lot of surprising things start to happen, is when you find these in-between areas. So say you have a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, you have complete order. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have complete chaos. There are certain points, depending on your system, of in-betweens that are not quite chaotic and not quite ordered, and they're beautiful. They're complex, and this complexity is what we really strive to chase. One of the things that we really enjoy about complexity, especially with these digital environments, is that often they lead to some emergent behavior. And just to kind of throw out a quick definition of emergent behavior is where you start with simple rules, and those rules give rise to complex behavior. Things that surprise you, that you don't expect, that shouldn't be there, but they are. So we really try to harness that in Algoplex 2 and create these algorithmically generated scenes to have a lot of these boundaries and these points, these in-betweens with some surprising emergent behavior. And we didn't want to just give that to people. We wanted the people to discover that for themselves. And that's what the control panel allows in Algoplex 2. It lets people play around with these little universes, these simulations, and find like the really fun parts of these models that nobody else really gets to see other than the people that use them in a professional setting. So why do we even need a 3D sculpture to explore these complexities? Like, what does that mean? Why even make it in the first place? Why not just put it on a computer screen and call it good? Well, I'm assuming there's at least a couple creative people in the audience. Okay, yeah, most everybody here. All right, cool. Well, there is this special quality that the sculptural aspect of Algoplex 2 gives these digital creations when it's cast back into the real world. There's something about the light hitting these panels and reflecting and bouncing and using the natural rules of our world that gives rise to even more emergent behavior. When we first tested out Algoplex 2 as a prototype, thank you.
Keep talking at all.
We were surprised because we were getting these optical illusions and these really interesting effects, and we were like kind of giddy. We were getting that feeling that creative people have when they know they're onto something, or that when you see a really good piece of art and it speaks to you, or you listen to a good song. There's something there, and we knew we had to chase it. You can see here that this is a good example of the light bouncing. If this were just on a computer screen, it would just be a black screen with white lines on it, but that's not what's happening here. You have light catching in these cups and reflecting and lighting up. And it's really tough to tell from these videos. They're not the best, and especially like flattening a 3D image and showing it a video of it doesn't have the same effect, but it really does make this piece special, and it really adds something to it. It gives it a little more presence and depth. So yeah, we felt like it was a little touch of magic that gave life to these digital creations. So yeah, having these multiple levels of emergence just really helps to give life in short. So all right, that is about it for Algoplex 2. I'm going to give a quick overview of a couple other of our projects so you can see some more of our work. Let's see. This was an installation that we did for a festival last year, and it is a LED sculpture. This would fall into one of our closer to the ordered side of the spectrum as far as our projects go. So you can see we have different animations, and we kind of use 3D space in an interesting way to play around with these algorithms, or to design algorithms that really, really light up the room and give it some presence. So, all right. SPACEFILLERS is an audio-visual, essentially, chorus of objects.
Turn the volume on.
Oh yeah, I will turn the volume for this one. So these objects are all connected to a Raspberry Pi that is running an algorithm that basically is creating a symphony. And each one of these objects is a creature that has its own voice in the symphony, in this kind of like cosmic song. So basically, there's not a song that repeats twice in the SPACEFILLERS project. But these songs do have a similar pattern, have a similar feel, which is important. All right, I'll show Algoplex 1. Why not? So Algoplex 1 is a cube, essentially. It contains quite a few LEDs and an accelerometer and a radio transmitter. And we use it as a remote to control live visuals, which is really fun. We actually debuted this project at a light festival at a park in Seattle. And we let all these little kids and adults who wanted to feel like little kids come up and play with the cube. And the visuals were projected on the side of the Asian Art Museum in Seattle, which is a space that a lot of people get to play with very often. And so it was really fun and really special for these people, these kids, to come up and have this really fun moment of holding this big, heavy light cube and moving it around and seeing the wall react to it. So, all right, and let's see. We are actually going to do a quick demonstration of some of our live visuals. I will get those set up, and Alex Miller will take it away.
Cool. Okay, so our plan here is that as Alex Nagy gets this set up and starts kind of playing some visuals for you guys, I tell you a little bit about how we got started. So we got started by VJing, which I assume maybe some people in this crowd know what VJing is. It's basically doing the visuals for a music show. And we created our first algorithmic art by VJing, and that's like a familiar story. And so I'm going to close this. There we go. So this is an example of something that, again, has that like order versus chaos duality, where you can have this like really strict geometric shapes like this one, and then you can introduce noise. And I think that idea that Alex Nagy, the other Alex, touched on that's really important is finding that right balance. You know, it's actually really easy to create chaotic things, to create things that are noisy and glitchy, and sometimes that is what you want, and that's awesome, but we try really hard to kind of hit this middle ground between those two things. So yeah, that's pretty much all of the content that we have, and I wanted to see if are there any more questions? Was there a hand over there? Oh, yeah, thank you.
Hi. So I was really interested in the algorithmic scene of the ecosystem that was on the side of your apartment building, and I was wondering if you can go over the process that you went through to get that, and is it something that grows over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to just show, I wasn't planning on doing this, but if I just open up my Vimeo, this is a private video. This is very secret, exclusive access to our process. If I can find it. So that project involved a lot of prototyping, more than any other project that we've done. And we actually worked with some other programmers to do some of that prototyping. So I'll just play the prototyping video in the background. But it basically consisted of reading papers about algorithmic botany and stuff, and like all these different ideas about like how to simulate cells, like cell walls, and how to generate trees, and then combining some of those ideas into an ecosystem. So we played around with like a lot of algorithms for that piece, and then narrowed it down to just a few, which was kind of an interesting experience to like have to throw away a lot of work. So yeah, that's a great question, and it's kind of a hard answer because it basically was just like a lot of work. Yeah, I guess I can say that one interesting aspect of that project is that there's this like tree growing algorithm, and it has all of these parameters. And tuning those parameters was one of the most labor-intensive parts of that project because I didn't actually know what the tree was going to look like until I ran it for days. And so it was kind of the sort of thing where I'd have to like start an experiment and run it, and the computer wasn't fast enough to like fast forward, right? So I actually had to like see the trees grow in real time to see what would happen. Yeah, great question. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi. For your sculptural work, how do you know when you're ready to move from like a virtual space where you might be prototyping to the physical space where you're investing a lot of time into building stuff and also money for the parts?
Yeah, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think, at least for Algoplex 2, the physical space was actually our original idea, and the digital spaces came after we had the idea for the sculptural aspect. We knew we wanted to do some kind of algorithmically generated scene on top of it, but I think the form followed the sculpture because we had to design some of these scenes to actually fit the sculptural aspect and play around with that geometry.
Cool. And quick follow-up. Do you think that the process for developing that work would have been different if you started just in a virtual space as opposed to like prototyping in the physical?
Yeah.
Okay, so an example of when we did that was with the SPACEFILLER's, what you called the Cosmic Orchestra, which is a great name for it. Probably a better name than SPACEFILLER's. So that was like that started from the virtual because we found these cool shapes, which are actually called, literally, they're called SPACEFILLERS because they tile space infinitely, and there's no gaps. And so we we played around with 3D models of that before we built it. And I actually think that it was kind of a somewhat disappointing result. I think it has worked better for us to start with the physical and get kind of hands-on first, because you have this intuitive sense of form when you're doing that, as opposed to playing in the virtual space, if that makes sense. It was like disappointing to see the first one. I was kind of like, oh, it looked better on the screen, you know. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about the music that you created for the SPACEFILLERS installation?
Yeah, and I think this will be the last question, right? Is that okay? Cool.
Sounds good.
So just really quickly, it was done in a rush. It was actually done in the art gallery after we installed the piece. Originally, the piece just kind of triggered these random sounds, but we found that it was just kind of boring, and it just like didn't really work. It was just noisy, right? It didn't have enough order, and so I was like coding in the space as Alex was like soldering LEDs together and getting everything working. I was like, just the simplest thing I could think of, which is basically a random chord progression is generated off of a set of simple rules about music theory. So kind of like following a graph of like what chords go after what other chords. And that did 90% of the work. Like as soon as you have a chord progression that feels emotional, you can kind of randomly walk around that chord progression in different ways and generate beautiful things. The drums were a little bit, there's a kind of a rhythmic part, which is like a little bit more complex. But yeah, that's a very quick answer to your question. Anyway, I think we're out of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.